inexcusable performance. There's even no words for that. That car finished second last week and the week before, and whatever we did to it was horrible. Lewis survived out there, but George, I can only feel for the two driving such a miserable thing. The main factor was that we couldn't go around the corners with the bigger wing with the pace we needed, and we were killing the tires, just eating them up within a few laps. This car doesn't deserve a win. I think we need to push for the last two races and recover, but the performance today was, I'm lacking words.
That was the rather blunt assessment that Toto Wolff had after what he described as Mercedes' worst race in 13 years. Now, whilst Toto is no stranger to a bit of hyperbole, whilst we have seen bad races and even double DNFs before from Mercedes, Brazil was something different. Lewis finished over a minute behind race winner Verstappen, they had their largest deficit in 2023, and Mercedes during the race were just the 7th best car. After the race, there was a lot of mixed messages from Mercedes, which basically indicated to me that more worrying than the pace itself, Mercedes and the drivers didn't really know why it happened exactly, and more importantly, what they could have done to fix it. There's no doubt that a bad setup direction after FP1 definitely played a part. After their Austin fiasco, which resulted in Lewis being disqualified from P2 for wearing his plank out beyond the legal limit, Mercedes wanted to play it a little bit more conservative during the sprint this weekend. Mercedes chose to run a higher ride height this weekend so as to not have a repeat of Austin. But when you run your car in a suboptimal ride height, you lose a significant amount of your downforce. To counteract this and to recover some of that lost downforce, Mercedes had to run with bigger wings on the car, but not only did this not produce the downforce that they needed, it also came with very costly consequences. Down the straights, Mercedes were by far the slowest. If we take a look at the speed trap data from the FIA, ignoring K-Mag and Albon who didn't even get past turn 1, Russell was the absolute slowest through the speed trap, with Lewis not too far ahead, and across the finish line, both Lewis and George set the slowest speeds. Having a draggier car that's slow in a straight line is an absolute disaster around Sao Paulo, as we saw. It left Hamilton and Russell sitting ducks on the straights, and on more than one occasion people were overtaking them on similar tyres before they'd even got into the braking zone. Hamilton even reported that Gasly was actually pulling away from him despite Lewis having a tow and DRS. Now, this isn't the first time that we've seen Mercedes be slow on the straights. Generally speaking, during the ground effect era, Mercedes has always had a draggier car and been one of the slower teams on the straights. But that has always come at the advantage of having better downforce, which usually allows them to work their tyres a lot less, and thus makes them have a better race car than quali car. In Sao Paulo, this just wasn't the case. The bigger rear wing just didn't give them the downforce that they expected, which meant that they actually were working their tyres a lot harder during the race. And around a track like Sao Paulo, which has always been a high degradation circuit, it's no surprise that Mercedes were just eating their tyres up. And now, Toto Wolff did say that beyond the setup direction, there was a fundamental mechanical issue with the car, and it was a combination of all of these factors which meant that, whilst over one lap the drivers could still extract a decent amount of performance, qualifying in 5th and 6th, over a race stint, the car just wasn't competitive. On top of that, reliability also turned out to be a problem. Russell retiring seemed to go under the radar a little bit because by that point, well, to be honest, he was barely holding on to the points at that point. In the end, Mercedes put it down to a cooling issue as they saw the oil temperature reach a critical level. And whilst George was doing the last race on that specific power unit, and other teams also had cooling issues as evidenced by the two Alfa Romeos retiring with similar issues, it's yet another problem that Mercedes just can't afford to have, especially if the car was competitive. So the upshot to all of that was that the car they had during the race lacked downforce, was slow on the straights, had really bad tyre wear, and was also unreliable as well. These ground effect cars fall out of their operating window so easily because of how tricky it is to seal the floor and then keep it there. The entire concept of generating most of your downforce through the floor means that It's all about your aerodynamic characteristics and how they interact with your mechanical platform, which is dictated by your suspension. Now, the fact that Mercedes have now been caught out twice during sprint weekends is not a coincidence. The unique challenge of having only 60 minutes of free practice to set your car up before it's locked in parc fermé and you're into qualifying for the race is something all teams must face. Although in qualifying the pace didn't look too bad, the sprint definitely sent alarm bells when both of the drivers had tyre problems and started dropping like stones. To be honest, Mercedes looked so bad that I actually tweeted after the sprint, as a bit of a joke but also being kind of serious, that Mercedes and Ferrari fans should probably just give tomorrow's race a pass, and looking at how it turned out for both of the teams, I think for once I was bang on the money. Now, the sprint rang so many alarm bells that, just like Aston Martin and Austin, the team genuinely considered taking both of their cars out of parc fermé, which would allow them to make setup changes, but it would have also meant that both of the drivers had to start the race from the pit lane. The problem there is, unlike Aston Martin and Austin, who originally qualified in P17 and P19, and so didn't really have anything to lose by starting from the pit lane, throwing away a P5 and P8 grid slot after Russell's penalty is no joke. There's no guarantee, especially with how close the grid was in Sao Paulo, that Mercedes would have just been able to make those positions back. But the bigger problem, as Toto pointed out after the race, was that even if Mercedes had started from the pit lane, they didn't know what setup changes to actually make. We didn't know what we needed to fundamentally change in the car to make it better. We thought about a pit lane start, but when thinking about maximizing points, it was probably right to start like this. In the end, Mercedes were actually lucky to even score the few points that they did with Lewis. It was obvious even from the sprint that whilst the usual upper midfield group of Aston Martin, McLaren and Ferrari were faster, in the race Mercedes were also slower than both Alpine and AlphaTauri. Despite qualifying in 5th and 8th, Lewis and George were only ever going to go backwards in the race, and had it not have been for Leclerc's car failure, which put him out of the race, and then also Ricciardo and Piastri being a lap down after suffering damage before the red flag, you've got to think that those cars would have managed to get ahead of Lewis, and Mercedes really should have left that Grand Prix pointless. After the race, understandably, it was mostly frustration from the drivers, with Russell believing that this weekend was just an anomaly, and Hamilton expressing how he's looking forward to never driving the W14 again. Now, whilst I'm sure that a lot of drivers probably feel the same way about their cars, I mean, I wonder how Leclerc feels about the SF23 after Sao Paulo, I thought that it was an interesting thing to say by Lewis, because going back 12 months, that is almost the exact same thing that he said about the W13 last season. This leads me on to my biggest concern going away from Brazil, and that is the simple concept that Mercedes still don't have a full grasp and understanding on why some things work or why some things don't, and more importantly, how to fix them. The team tried to put a positive spin on it by saying that a one-off weekend doesn't take away from the fact that generally this season, the car has actually been pretty good. Before Lewis's 2nd place in Mexico, had he not crashed out in Qatar and been disqualified in Austin, there is a very real possibility that Lewis could have had a run of 3 straight 2nd place finishes behind Max in the last 4 races. But weekends like this do matter. They show that Mercedes still have a gap in their knowledge. It shows that even compared to last year, they haven't made as much progress as it seems, and it puts doubt in my mind about their ability to bring a brand new concept next season that might actually be able to challenge Red Bull. I think for me, what it all comes down to is that I don't really care that Mercedes had a bad weekend per se, because loads of teams have bad weekends. I mean, look at Red Bull in Singapore, or even Red Bull in Sao Paulo last year. But it frustrates me thinking about the future. The reason why 2023 has been as predictable up at the front has been entirely because of Mercedes and Ferrari. If they still don't fully understand what it is about their cars that's making them so uncompetitive now, then what is stopping that same knowledge gap from influencing their new cars next season? Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.